A wolf's corpse swings from the gallows, dressed in human clothes, wearing a powdered wig and the carved wooden face of a man everyone in town despised. The crowd cheers, children point and laugh. Justice, they believe, has finally been served. But here's the thing about justice in 1685 Germany. It came with fangs, four legs, and a very twisted sense of theater. See, this is the story of how an entire town convinced themselves they'd killed their tyrannical leader by executing a wolf. And honestly, they might not have been completely wrong. The good people of Ansbach thought they'd killed two birds with one stone that autumn day in 1685. Or rather, one tyrant with one wolf. They stood in their town square, staring up at what they'd created. Part animal, part effigy, part fever dream of revenge. They'd found a way to hang their oppressor without technically committing murder. But then again, when you're dealing with monsters, the line between symbolic and literal has a way of getting very, very blurry. Let me paint you the world as it was in 17th century Germany. The 30 Years' War has been over for less than 40 years, and the scars still run very deep. See, these small principalities, these tiny kingdoms and duchies, scattered across what we now call Germany, see, they're still rebuilding, still figuring out how to live again. Life expectancy hovers around, 35 if you're lucky. Most people never travel more than 20 miles from where they're born. And your entire universe consists of maybe a few hundred souls, all crammed together in a world where privacy doesn't exist and everyone knows everyone else's business. It sounds horrible in all honesty. And in Ansbach, this small, unremarkable principality in what's now Bavaria, the man in charge was making everyone's already rather short, brutish life even shorter and even more brutish. The Vogt of Ansbach, that's what they called him. He was essentially the local administrator, the man who collected taxes, enforced laws, and generally made sure the common people remembered exactly where they stood in the grand scheme of things, which was, to put it mildly, at the very bottom of the pecking order. You see, but this particular Vought wasn't just doing his job, he was savoring it. He taxed families into starvation, and then he would tax them for being too poor. He had a talent for finding new ways to make people miserable, new regulations that seemed designed purely to cause suffering. This was the kind of petty cruelty that comes from someone who's been given just enough power to be dangerous, but not enough to truly be important or matter. You know the type. We've all met them. The middle manager, basically, of medieval tyranny. And in a world where everyone lived on top of each other, where you couldn't even escape your own neighbors or your rulers, this man was a constant, grinding presence. A human-shaped reminder that fairness was a luxury you couldn't afford. The townspeople would whisper about him in dark corners. They would curse his name in languages their grandmothers had taught them. And they dreamed of justice in ways they'd never dare speak aloud. But then, as if the universe had decided one monster wasn't quite enough for the good people of Ansbach, another predator appeared on the scene. A wolf. Now, wolves weren't exactly rare in 17th century Germany. The forests were very thick, the wilderness was vast, and predators were a simple part of life. But this wolf, this one was different. It was massive, for starters. Witnesses described it as larger than any wolf they'd ever seen, with an intelligence in its eyes that made grown men cross themselves and mutter prayers. It moved with purpose, and it hunted with strategy. And it seemed to have an uncanny knowledge of human behavior. The wolf's first victims were livestock, as anyone would expect. A sheep here, a goat there, normal predator behavior really. But then the attacks became more brazen, more calculated. It would strike at exactly the moments when the townspeople were most vulnerable. During harvest season, when everyone was in the fields, and during market days, when attention was elsewhere. It almost seemed to know the rhythms of human life better than most humans did. Families would lose entire flocks overnight. Shepherds would find scenes of carnage that went beyond simple hunger. This looked like rage, like cruelty for its own sake. Sound familiar? But then, and this is where our story gets really interesting, someone made a connection that would change everything. See, you have to understand, in 1685, the supernatural wasn't supernatural at all. It was just natural. Werewolves, witches, demons, angels, they were as real as your neighbor's cow. More real in a lot of cases, because the supernatural at least had the decency to be obviously dangerous. So an old clause, and there's always an old clause in these stories, pointed out that the wolf's attacks seemed to follow the same patterns as their Vot's cruelties. And well, people started paying attention. See, the wolf struck hardest at the families who'd been most recently taxed into poverty. It seemed to know exactly which households were struggling, which ones were weak, just like the Vot did when he came collecting. And here's the detail that really got people talking. Nobody had ever seen the wolf and the Vot at the same place. The idea spread through Ansbach like plague through a medieval city. Quick, infectious, and absolutely unstoppable. Think about it from their perspective. You're living under the thumb of a man who seems to take genuine pleasure in your suffering. A man who knows your weaknesses, who strikes when you're most vulnerable, and who displays a kind of casual cruelty that feels almost inhuman. And then this wolf appears, displaying exactly the same characteristics. In a world where transformation was possible, where the boundary between human and animal was more philosophical than physical, it wasn't a huge leap to conclude that they were dealing with the same creature wearing different skins. The Vought was a werewolf. Had to be. And once people started looking for connections, they seemed to find them everywhere. Because that's what people do. See, we're pattern-seeking creatures, even when the patterns don't actually exist. The wolf's howls seemed to echo from the direction of the Vaught's residence. The attacks increased whenever the Vought had been particularly cruel to someone. On nights when the Vought claimed to be traveling on official business, the wolf would be spotted prowling the outskirts of town. And then there was the physical similarities that people swore they could see. The wolf's eyes, they said, held the same cold intelligence as the Vaught's, the same calculating cruelty. Maria the baker claimed she'd seen the beast pause to stare at her through her window with the look of pure human hatred, just like the Vought did when he passed her shop. Johann the blacksmith swore the wolf had deliberately destroyed his fence in exactly the same pattern the Vought had once deranged his tax collector's harassment. Systematic, thorough, and designed to cause maximum suffering with minimum effort. Now, were these observations real or the product of fear and desperation? Does it really matter? In their world, belief was reality. If enough people believed the Vought was a werewolf, then for all practical purposes, he was. But then something beautiful happened. Something that shows you exactly what humans are capable of when they finally say, enough. The townspeople organized. For the first time in years, maybe decades, they came together with a single purpose. Rich and poor, young and old, families that had been feuding for generations suddenly found themselves united against a common enemy. They formed hunting parties. They shared information, resources, weapons. They turned their intimate knowledge of local terrain into a weapon of their own. And for the first time since the Vought had taken power, they had hope. Think about that for a moment. These people had lived under oppression for so long that the possibility of fighting back had become literally unthinkable. But give them a supernatural enemy, something they could hunt without technically committing treason, and suddenly they remembered they had claws of their own. The hunt lasted weeks. Groups of men with spears and nets, following tracks through ancient forest, setting traps, coordinating ambushes. They had approached it with the kind of methodical intelligence that comes from desperation. And slowly, gradually, they began to close the net. The wolf's patterns became predictable once you had enough people watching, enough eyes tracking its movements. It was smart, but it was still an animal, still bound by animal needs and animal logic. They cornered it in a ravine about 3 miles outside of town, trapped between steep walls and a dozen armed and angry humans who had had quite enough of being terrorized. The fight was brutal and brief. The wolf was massive, aggressive, and desperate, but it was also outnumbered and outmaneuvered. When it finally fell, pierced by multiple spears and bleeding out on the forest floor, the townspeople stood in a circle around its body and felt something they hadn't experienced in years: victory. But then, as they stared down at their kill, someone, probably that same old Claus who'd made the original connection, said the words that would transform this from a simple hunting success into something much more profound. "We've killed the Vought." And that's when things got really, really interesting, because now they had a choice to make. See, they could either dispose of the wolf's body quietly, the way you'd handle any dangerous animal, or they could do something that had never been done before in the history of supernatural justice. They could give their symbolic victory the ceremony it deserved. The idea probably started as a joke, more than likely, someone suggesting they should dress up the wolf like the man they believed it to be. But jokes have a way of becoming reality when enough desperate people start taking them seriously. Within hours, they had a plan. Not just a plan, a vision. They would give their hated Vought the public execution he deserved, using the body of the wolf they believed he had become. What happened next was part funeral, part execution, and part theater of the absurd, and also entirely unforgettable. See, they carried the wolf's carcass back to town like hunters displaying their prize, which they were. But instead of skinning it or butchering it for meat like normal, they began the most bizarre preparation in the history of Germanic justice. First, they dressed it in human clothes, a man's coat. Some say it was actually one of the Vought's own coats, stolen for the occasion. Breeches, a shirt, all carefully fitted onto the wolf's still warm body. And then came the wig, a proper powdered wig, the kind that marks someone as a person of authority in their world. They placed it ever so carefully on the wolf's head, adjusting it until it sat just right. But the masterpiece, the detail that would be remembered for centuries, was the face. They cut away the wolf's snout and then carved a wooden mask in the likeness of their own Vought, complete with his distinctive features, his cruel expression, and even the small scar he carried above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident. And then they fitted this mask over the mutilated face of their kill. When they were finished, they had created something that had never existed before: a werewolf dressed for its own execution. They strung it up on the public gallows in the town square, the same gallows where actual criminals met their end. And then they invited everyone: men, women, children, visiting merchants, neighboring farmers, to come and witness justice being served. The crowd that gathered was unlike anything Ansbach had ever seen before. People came from miles around to stare at this impossible thing hanging from the gibbet. Part wolf, part human, and part symbol of everything they'd suffered under their oppressive ruler. And they cheered, and they laughed, and they pointed and celebrated as if they had just witnessed the execution of their greatest enemy, which in their minds they had. But then here's where the story gets even stranger, because after the execution, something remarkable happened to the real Vought. His power seemed to evaporate overnight. The man who had terrorized them for years suddenly found himself unable to command the same fear, the same automatic obedience. It was as if his wolf form being killed had somehow broken his hold over them. Some historians suggest the Vought was so unnerved by the whole experience that he voluntarily reduced his harsh policies. Others think the townspeople, having discovered their own power through collective action, simply stopped obeying him with the same automatic submission. But there's a third possibility, one that the people of Ansbach would have found perfectly reasonable. Maybe they really had killed something supernatural that day. Maybe the connection between the wolf and their oppressor was more literal than symbolic. After all, the wolf attacks stopped completely after the execution, and the Vought was never quite the same. What the people of Ansbach had really done was something much more sophisticated than simple superstition. They'd found a way to execute their oppressor without technically executing their oppressor and committing murder or treason. Think about the genius of it. They couldn't rise up against their Vought directly. That would have been rebellion punishable by death. But they could hunt a dangerous wolf. And they could execute a supernatural threat to their community. By transforming their human oppressor into a monster, they'd found a loophole in the entire system of feudal power. And what a psychological weapon they'd created. Imagine being the Vought, having to walk through that town square every day, past the gallows where a dressed-up wolf hung, wearing your face. Every citizen who saw you would remember that image. Every interaction would carry the subtle message: we know what you are, and we've already killed you once. It was the most elegant form of psychological warfare ever devised by medieval peasants, and maybe in history. They figured out how to haunt their oppressor while he was still alive. The story of the Ansbach Werewolf spread throughout Germany and beyond. Other towns began to whisper about the possibility that their own cruel leaders might be more than human. Wolves were hunted with new enthusiasm, and more than a few ended up dressed in human clothes for very public executions. The case became one of the most documented werewolf trials in European history, not because of any legal proceedings, but because of the sheer audacity of what the townspeople had done. So was the Vought of Ansbach really a werewolf? Did they actually execute a supernatural creature that autumn day in 1685? Or did they simply find the most creative solution to political oppression in the history of medieval Europe? Here's the beautiful thing about this story. It doesn't matter. What matters is that an entire community found a way to transform their powerlessness into power, their fear into action, their oppression into justice. The next time you hear about werewolves, remember Ansbach. Remember that sometimes our monsters are exactly as human as we make them, and sometimes, just sometimes, we find ways to hang them from the gallows of our own making, even if we have to dress them up as wolves first. That's the story of how a German town in 1685 solved two problems with one very bizarre execution. They proved that justice doesn't always come from judges and laws and proper procedures. Sometimes it comes from the woods, wearing fangs and carrying the face of everything you've learned to hate. History, my friends, is rarely as simple as we'd like it to be, but it's always stranger than fiction. And sometimes in the space between the strange and the simple, we find truths that are more real than anything in our textbooks. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe and drop a comment below with any thoughts or recommendations. The Werewolf of Ansbach taught us that monsters are made and not born, and that sometimes the best way to kill them is to help them become exactly what they always were.